So you find yourself shooting in a low light situation. You've already got your ISO turned up pretty high, your shutter speed is pretty slow, and you really need to speed up that shutter speed. So what do? Do you increase your ISO? Do you maybe underexpose? Well, that's a great question, and in this video we're going to check it out together. Stick around. So a lot of the videos we do here are answering questions that we ask ourselves and each other. And this is one of those. I shoot in a lot of dark situations. I shoot a lot of dark rides where I can't put the camera on a tripod, and I'm shooting at a high ISO, and I really need my shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second, 1/100th of a second, something fast enough to stop motion. But what do I do if it's not fast enough? I need to speed up my shutter speed. How do I get my shutter speed faster? Well, I can increase my ISO, or I can underexpose and I can shoot at a faster shutter speed that way. But which is the better way to do it? If I'm shooting at ISO 1600, is it better to shoot at 1600 and underexpose a couple of stops and increase my brightness in the computer later on? Or do I just add 2 stops of ISO, shoot at ISO 6400 and get a faster shutter speed that way? What's going to give me the better image quality? What's going to give me less grain and a nicer image overall? Well, that's a great question. I didn't know the answer, so I decided to try to figure it out myself. So let's jump into the computer. I took a few pictures. I have some examples, and we'll compare side by side to see which gives us the best result.
Okay, so I started with an image here. I brought it into Lightroom. I don't know what this is. I needed something that had some brightness and darkness in the same image, so this was shot in a old-timey blacksmith shop. Again, I don't know what this is. Maybe if you can recognize it, put it in the comments below. It would be interesting to hear what it is, but I just needed something to shoot that had, like I said, bright spots and dark spots. So this is my basic image. Shot at ISO 100, 1/40th of a second at f2.8. What I wanted to do then, and I did this in 3 steps, a low ISO, a medium range ISO, and a very high ISO. And I took this same image and I said, what if I needed a faster shutter speed, faster than 1/40th of a second? So I increased my ISO to 400 and I got a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, which was definitely fast enough. So then the question is it better to increase my ISO to 400 to get a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, or is it better to underexpose by 2 stops and then increase the exposure in Lightroom? So I took this other image here, which is shot at ISO 100. I underexposed by 2 stops, therefore giving me the exposure of 1/125th of a second that I wanted. And then in Lightroom, I already increased it by 2 stops of brightness to match the brightness of the ISO 400 image. So you can see when I compare these next to each other, they're the same exposure. But how do they compare when you look a little closer? So digging in here a little bit closer, you can see the ISO 100 image that I increased the brightness by 2 stops is on the left, and the native image, the correctly exposed ISO 400 image, is on the right. And in this part, the part that's in focus, the part that has a lot of detail to it and texture and things, you really can't see any difference between the two. I would actually say the one on the right, the native ISO correctly exposed 400 image, looks a little bit better there, but they're really very comparable. So digging into the darker parts, the shadows, there's this bucket in the back here. If I get in close to that, you can see, taking a look now at the grain, the image on the left that I underexposed is very comparable to the one on the right, which was shot at the correct exposure. There's really not much difference at all between these two. I would actually say the one on the right is a little bit cleaner, but there really isn't much to compare. So what about some out of focus spots that are a little brighter, like down here on the left? Digging a little bit closer there, and you can see, again, very, very comparable between these two. But if I had to pick one, I would say there's a little bit more grain in the ISO 100 image that I underexposed 2 stops than there is at the correctly exposed ISO 400. Not very noticeable, but very, very, very little difference. I prefer the correctly exposed image between these two. Okay, so let's compare now, bumped up at a higher ISO. My native ISO in this shot, let's say I needed a 1/500th second exposure. My correctly exposed ISO is 1600, and I'm getting the correct exposure here on the right. On the left is an image I shot at ISO 400, and I underexposed by 2 stops to get the same 1/500th of a second exposure. And you can see they're both exposed basically exactly the same. So let's dig in a little bit closer to see what they look like up close. And you can see at ISO 1600, you're starting to get a little bit of grain in the texture and detail here. But really not much of a difference at all between these two in the in focus texture section in the middle here. So let's dig into the dark shadows in the back, and you can see on the right hand side the correctly exposed ISO 1600 image. There's a little bit of grain in there. Actually, it's really pretty good for an ISO 1600 shot. It's really not very grainy at all. And on the left hand side is the ISO 400 image, underexposed and then brightened up in Lightroom. And again, both of these are very comparable. I think the ISO 1600 shot looks a little bit nicer. It's just a little bit less grainy. And again, you run the risk when you're underexposing of losing some of the detail in the shadows back here that you might not want to lose. Let's take a look at the brighter areas, the out of focus brighter spots here. And again, these are both very, very comparable. Really not much difference at all between these two. And again, if I'm being really picky, I prefer the correctly exposed ISO 1600 image. But you're not going to see much difference between the two. So let's push it a little bit more extreme here. I bumped my ISO all the way up to 25,600, and my shot here on the right is at 1/8,000th of a second. This is correctly exposed. The one on the left, I left at an ISO 6400, and I underexposed it by 2 stops and increased it by 2 stops brightness in Lightroom. So digging a little bit closer, you're going to see a lot of grain, which you always do at high ISOs like this. And between the two, again, the grain is very comparable. I think the ISO 6400 image on the left is probably a little bit cleaner, but both very similar. Digging into the shadows in the back, very, very similar between these two. There's almost no difference in the grain. Looking at the brighter out of focus areas on the bottom, you can see they're both very, very comparable, almost identical. But let's just take a quick look. If I wanted to actually clean up the noise in Lightroom, let's take a look at these two images here, how that would compare if I clean them up. So here I applied a noise reduction of 60 to both of these images, which is pretty heavy, but they're high ISOs. And it actually cleans up pretty nicely. It's a usable image. But they're basically the same between the two also, even with the digitally cleaned up ISO. Look in the shadows, look in the brighter spots. They're really very, very similar. So the conclusion is basically you're not going to find much difference between underexposing an image in order to shoot at a lower ISO. If you're going to have to increase the exposure afterwards in Lightroom, you're going to get a very similar grain and amount of noise in your image between the two shots. So what I would recommend doing is shooting at the correct ISO for the correct exposure, because you're going to lose less detail in the shadows if you do that. But really at all of these ranges, the low level ISOs, the mid range, 400, 1600, and on the extreme end between 6400 and 25,600, there really isn't any difference whether you're shooting it at the correct exposure or underexposing and correcting it later on in Lightroom.
So I hope you found that interesting. I know I did. It answered some questions for me. I'm going to put links here to the high ISO tests that we did for the Canon M50 and for the Canon EOS R, and how they compare to the Canon 5D Mark IV. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.